Hello, this video is a review of a book called Between Two Fires, and it is about Russia. Now, before we go into the book, why I think Russia is very important for anyone interested in international affairs and ought for anyone interested to try to have some serious understanding of that country and its experience. Russia is politically very important simply because it is the inheritor of a superpower, the Soviet Union. But in addition to that, it is a country of many interests in different parts of the world. Militarily, it is a country that is able to assertively secure and often impose its interests. Geographically, Russia is not just colossal, but in addition to that, it is in a part of the world that is by default strategic. It has borders with China, borders with Iran, which basically gives it access to the Middle East. It is effectively the eastern border of, or the eastern neighbor of the European Union. It has effectively reach towards the Nordic countries, the Baltics, so more or less to the top of the world. It is one of the most important players in the energy industry, which of course is a very strategic industry worldwide. Russia's political transition over the past 20-25 years has been of immense interest to political scientists, political economists, anybody really interested in the notion of political transition, which is an important notion in the field of international relations in the last 2 or 3 decades. And finally, Russia is a weighty country because of its very valuable contributions to philosophy, literature, music, theater. It has seeped into the psyche of so many people in the world. The notion of Russia itself is very rich, and therefore the country has gravitas. Now, why this book? For different reasons, but 2 are particularly important. One, the author, Joshua Yaffa, was for a number of years the main editor on Russia at Foreign Affairs. Now, not because I write for Foreign Affairs, but it is arguably the most influential journal or magazine in the world about international relations. And after leaving Foreign Affairs, he went to write for The New Yorker, which is not only also very important and influential newspaper or magazine, primarily in the US, but also in the West, but specifically The New Yorker's style is extended essays, which means that The New Yorker does not really tell you what happened, but rather why it happened. It gives you the background, the contexts. My point here is that someone like Joshua Yaffa, the author of this book, is someone in a small group of people who contributed to how the American and the Western mind in general, specifically policy circles, have thought about or seen Russia in the last 10-15 years. And that by itself makes him an influential author. The second reason this book, I think, merits attention is its approach and its style. Usually you find American observers of Russia approaching Russia from 1 or 2 ways. One approach is looking at Russia as a competitor and often an enemy. And the other approach is looking at Russia from a very romantic view, very rosy spectacles. And the first one is very confrontational. The second one is somehow sees Russia becoming Western, becoming almost American, if it adopts certain policies or moves on certain trajectories. This book, Between Two Fires, does not do that. It approaches Russia from a bottom-up way, through looking at the trajectory of the lives or the experiences of a number of Russians in Russia in the last 25, 30 years. In my view, that is a novel approach, and also it is a respectful approach, in my view. Some people say, well, there's nothing new in that approach. It is very common in anthropology, in literature, of course. But I think for books written to international audiences, primarily political books, it is not very common to find a book adopting this bottom-up approach. So, a socio-political way of looking at Russia, and a respectful way, again, in my view. So what are the messages that emerge out of that book? I personally think that the real value of Between Two Fires is that it is educational. So if you are interested in Russia, and I think, again, anyone interested in international affairs ought to pay special attention to Russia, it is educational in the sense it tells us a lot about how the Russian society, in different corners of it, in different segments of it, experienced the last 20, 30 years, especially that they were of one of the most important transitions, political transitions in the world in that period. That by itself gives the book value. But in addition to that, it focuses on two areas that I believe are illuminating really about Russia. The first is the social contract in the country. And what the author does, I think, excellently, is show us how the social contract, the relationship between the state and the people, has evolved a lot in the past 25, 30 years, and especially the last 20 years under President Putin, far, far, far from the relationship that was there between, or under the Soviet Union, between the Soviet authorities and the citizens at the time, and certainly from the years of deprivation in the 1990s. He especially, the author, pays special attention or particular attention to the idea of a give and take between the state and the people, whereby there's some sort of a transactional relationship. You can say less political rights in return for major improvement, not just in the living standards, but in the aspirations and the materialization of these aspirations of large segments of the middle class. Now, of course, there are several people who would say that's absolutely fine, several people would say absolutely bad, but the point here is not the judgment on that social contract, but rather the evolution of that social contract in the last 2 or 3 decades. The second point that I think is very valuable for observers of Russia or students of Russia in that 20 or 30 years is the idea of the link between this evolving social contract and the idea of nationalism. But not nationalism in the simple style of you are nationalist as in you care about your country, you love your country. What this book does intelligently is to show that there was a need for many people in Russia, not just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but especially after the years of the 1990s, in which Russia appeared to have lost a lot of its positioning, of its power, of its influence in different parts of the world, and how in the last 20 years one of the successes of the Putin administration in front of large segments of Russians is how it managed to return, resuscitate even, that dignity of Russia in its immediate neighborhood and in different parts of the world where it has interests. So basically, the mix between the evolution of the social contract in the last 20 years or so, and the return of the Russian presence in the world and how that resonates with the Russian nationalism, these two factors together, I think the book explains very well and uses them to tell us a lot about the social contract, the experience, the psyche of the Russian society over the past 20 or 30 years. Another point which I think is very valuable about this book is that it also looks at the future. It does not really speculate much on who will potentially rule Russia in the period post President Putin. And some people will say, good, because actually now in July 2020 we are seeing steps that potentially prolong the Putin era in Russia. But I think what is much more important than who will rule after President Putin, and which the book does very well, is to look at the constituencies that benefited, the constituencies that got its or their power diluted or were weakened in the past 10-15 years. The ideas that were strengthened in that period and the ideas that were weakened. In other words, it helps readers, observers of Russia, think about how the immediate or short-term, maybe medium-term future of Russia in the period post-President Putin will be like, not in terms of individuals, not in terms of power groups, but rather in terms of the landscape of Russia. It helps us see what really matters in Russia. And I think good books, international relation books, that focus on certain countries do a favor to the readers, not by telling them, I think this will happen, but rather by educating the readers on where they ought to look, where they ought to pay attention, which variables they ought to assess. And that, this book does that very well.